something. Um, Let me show you where we are at in Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4 broken up into four main divisions. We have been through the first two. We will cover the last two this morning. The first part was Moses telling the people to follow God's word. Do not forget to follow God and follow God's word. And then the week after that, and then last week we finished up that second section, which was on forsaking idolatry. And he's telling them in that section, listen, when you go into the promised land, there are going to be remnants of idolatry there. The people that live there now are idolaters. And you need to make sure that you forsake that idolatry. Do not get involved in that. And then future disobedience, obviously we'll get in that today in the favor of God. But what a strange thing. He goes from forsake idolatry. He's telling them forsake idolatry. And then what he does in the very next section, which is where we're at, we're going to pick it up in verse 25 here in just a minute. He literally has just finished telling them, forsake idolatry. Do not worship idols. And the very next breath, the section that we're in, he tells them, however, when you do worship idols. And so we'll take a look at that. We'll pick it up at verse 25, where it says, when you beget children. He's going to set the timeline for them here. When you beget children and grandchildren and have grown old in the land. Now he starts out there, verse 25, this section, giving them a timeline. Now this is for you and I. We've got to pay attention here because what happens is this can throw us off. When you beget children, okay? Now let me talk to high school service right now, Sunday morning right now. Let me just say to you, I want you to imagine yourself when you have children. Okay? Now imagine yourself when you have grandchildren. And then, thirdly, I want you to imagine yourself when you have grown old in the land. Now, all of those stages of life, the children stage, the grandchildren stage, and the growing old in the land stage, those are all stages that for you and I, because we are human beings, those things seem so far away, especially for beautiful young students like yourself. You know, you're thinking children, that's for like when you're old. Grandchildren is for when you are dusty. Growing old in the land, basically dead, right? That's the way we think. Like when you think about your parents, think about your parents for a minute. They're so old, right? And every once in a while you'll see them kiss and, oh, that's so gross. Why? Because you guys are so old, you know? But then it's funny because your parents kissing is gross, but then your grandparents kissing would be like, oh, it's kind of cute, you know? But it's funny the way that we think, you know? But when you and I think about, when you consider, I mean, you guys, I've already got kids, so you guys consider yourselves. When you think about, well, I mean, the stage of my life when I have kids, man, I'm going to be pretty old. And then grandchildren, forget about it, right? Old. But then when I've grown old in the land, and those things seem to us to be such a long way from right now where you're sitting at. And so I want you to also do this. I want you to consider how old you are. How old are you? We probably have some 14-year-olds in here. Maybe 15, 16, 17, 18, I would imagine. Okay? Think about that. I want you to think about the stage of life that you're in right now. Especially those of you that are seniors, man. Or if you're a junior going into your senior year, how fast did that time go? And you just go, oh man, you're right. Like when you're going as a freshman, right? Those of you that are freshmen right now still officially, but you're about to go into 10th grade, when you were coming into your freshman year, you probably thought, oh man, it's like, you know, so I'm going to be a freshman forever. And now all of a sudden, the school year is over, and wait a minute, I'm about to hit 10th grade? What happened? It goes so quick. So I want you to think about your age right now. You know, you're 13, you're 14, you're 15, you're 16, 17, 18, whatever you are. How fast did that go? Now double that. Because the next half of that, you know, if you're 17 right now, the next 17 years is going to go by even faster than the first 17 did. That's what happens. You've noticed it yourselves, I'm sure by this point, you've noticed that, you know, is it just me? You're looking around like, is it just me, or is time speeding up? Like, what's going on? Because you just feel like time is moving so fast. And so while God speaking through Moses is telling them, listen, when you have children, and then when you have grandchildren, and when you grow old in the land, to them it would seem like such a long time. But as we will find out here, we'll find out in verse 26, he's going to tell them, listen, that time is coming soon. And it seems like a long time right now, again, because we think, and obviously with our human brains, because that's what we are, we're human. But you must understand that God sees things because he is all-powerful, all-knowing, right? He is omniscient, omnipotent. He sees things all at once. You and I go to a parade. I love parades. Anybody else in here love parades? Anybody? Yes? I love parades. The louder the parade, the better. Marching bands, love them. The more bands it has, can never have enough music. Need more horns, more drums. Let's go. And when I'm sitting at a parade, the last parade I was at was a couple of years ago. I went to the Rose Parade for the first time in my life. Been in California all my life. Finally went to the Rose Parade. It was incredible. Wasn't long enough, wasn't loud enough for me, but it was pretty cool. And you're sitting there, and you got your drink or whatever, and you're enjoying. And the floats are coming by one at a time. If you've never been to the Rose Parade, you need to go. You can smell the floats, all the flowers. You can smell them as they're going by. And I've got a terrible sense of smell. But they're going by, marching bands go, oh man, and then you look down, you get up and you look down the street, everybody does that. They get up, like the little kids are looking down, and Pastor Chris, and I'm like looking down, like, oh, where's it, man, I can't see the end, and then you look down that way, like, I don't know, where's it go? I don't know, it just goes forever. And it just seems to go forever. And yet, if you and I were to get up into one of those Goodyear blimps, okay, everybody knows what a Goodyear blimp is? That egg-shaped big silver blimp that's up in the sky. You get up in that blimp, you get up high enough, you can look and you go, oh, there's the beginning over there, and oh, there's the end. You see it all at once. All at once. That's how God views things. He sees them all at once. He's not waiting for things to happen, and oh, it's going to happen. So when he tells them here, listen, there's going to come a time when you have children and grandchildren, and you've grown old in the land, and then in verse 26, he says that's going to come really, really soon. That's why. So what you and I want to do is we want to do our best to try to view things the way that God views them. If God views human life as brief, I want to view human life as brief. I want to pay attention. That's going to help me stay on guard and pay attention and stay focused. He goes on to say in verse 25, when you beget children and grandchildren, and have grown old in the land. So it's coming. It's in the future, but it's coming. He says, and act corruptly, and make a carved image in the form of anything, and do evil in the sight of the Lord your God to provoke him to anger. There's a comma there. We'll get to the rest of it in just a minute. But he uses two phrases to explain to them what's coming in the future. He says, you are going to act corruptly and do evil, he says. Now, what is this corruption and what is this evil? Well, he tells them, you are going to act corruptly and make a carved image in the form of anything. We talked about carved images back in verses 16, 17, and 18. He just finished telling them, when you get into the promised land, do not make a carved image and then worship it. He goes on to tell them also about creation. Do not worship creation, the sun, the moon, the stars, the trees, the rivers. Don't worship those things. But he just finished talking to them about making carved images and not worshiping them. And he says, don't do that. And then beginning in verse 25, he says, however, when you do it. When you do that in the future. Is that because Moses is just being like a big bummer in summer and, oh man, come on, you don't believe in us, you doubt us or whatever? It is because this was Moses being motivated by God. This is God speaking to the people through Moses. And because God knows the heart of the people, because God knows, Moses knows. Moses himself saw it, right? You remember the golden calf incident? The incident of the golden calf? When the people had barely come out of Egypt, they still had Egyptian dust on their chanclas. And they're going through the wilderness, and what happened? Moses disappears up on the mountain. He's getting the 10 Commandments. Man, give the guy a break. Come on. But they said, oh, he's been gone too long. Make us a golden calf that we can worship and that will lead us back to Egypt. So that idolatry is in their hearts. It's ingrained in there. However, we are talking about a new generation. Those of you that have been around for, been along for the ride, you know that older generation died off. And this is a younger generation. But still, he's telling them, when you get into the promised land, you're going to act corruptly. You are going to do evil. You are going to turn away from the Lord, and you are going to make a carved image in the form of anything, whatever it might have been, a person, a bug, an animal, and you're going to worship it. And he says at the end of verse 25, and you do evil in the sight of the Lord your God, you are going to provoke him to anger. You're going to provoke him to anger. It's going to happen. And he says, when that happens in verse 26, Moses says to them, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. It's like, I'm telling you, I'm warning you, I'm telling you this is what's going to happen. So I'm calling heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that you will soon utterly perish from the land which you cross over the Jordan to possess. You will not prolong your days in it, but will be utterly destroyed. So in one breath, he tells them, he warns them, stay away from idolatry. In the very next breath, he says, you won't be able to stay away from idolatry. You're going to take part in idolatry. And when that happens, some other things are going to happen. He says there, when that happens, in verse 26, you will soon utterly perish from the land. So the land, this is a trip. They're not even in the land yet. They're getting ready. He told them there, you're getting ready to cross over the Jordan into the promised land. They're all excited. Woo! Something just like moving into a new house, Oh, man, finally, you get your own bedroom or whatever, and you're just all excited. And then someone tells you, hey, listen, enjoy your time in that house because you won't have it for long. Oh, man, come on, why are you trying to bum me out? Like, what are you doing? Like, I'm trying to be excited, and you're trying to rain on my parade. And Moses is telling them, you're getting ready to go into the land. Yeah, woo, yeah, don't worship idols. Woo, yeah, we're not going to worship idols. Listen, you're not going to be in there for long, so enjoy it while you can, because you're going to end up worshiping idols. What a wild thought. But God already knew the people. He already knew how they were going to respond. And so he's witnessing against them. He's telling them, you're not going to last long in the land. You're going to utterly perish from the land. You will not prolong your days in it, but will be utterly destroyed. You're going to be destroyed, Israelites, he's telling them. Man, because he knows that the heart of the people are fickle. I was at the LA County Fair last week or the week before, and went into the animal pen underneath the big red barn. I don't know if any of you have been in there, but I love sheep. And so I went in there, bought the feed and went in there and feeding the sheep. And you got to hide the feed from them, man. I was putting it down in my pocket, like, because they'll come and they'll actually jump up on you trying to get that food. And it was just the funniest thing. I would if I pulled the food out, they saw the cup. They see the cup, and they see you reach in. They're watching you, and you pull a cup out. They see that cup. They come over to you immediately. And they're sniffing around and trying to grab it. If you go like this, they're jumping on you. And so I'm trying to hide it and do all this kind of stuff. And what would happen is, when I had my feet out, they would see me, pour some into my hand, and I was feeding, and they would be licking my hand and sniffing. And then I would take the cup at the same time and I would stuff it into my pocket. And then once I was done, I would show my hands, and they would sniff my hands, and then they would split. And they'd go look for somebody else that had feet. Fickle. As long as I had something to give, they loved me. But the moment that I didn't and they realized it, they're like, where's the next clown? Where's the next fool that, came over here and, bought us food? Who's going to feed me? It was fickleness. They're just willing to go wherever. It doesn't matter. Whoever's got their hand out, whoever's got something to give, then that's where they're going to. And these people here, God knows their heart is fickle. That they're looking just to be pleased. Remember people when they were first starting to follow Jesus? And he was multiplying fish and loaves and healing people. And then Jesus said, listen, everybody, I want you to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And they all just like, what in the world did he just say? And they all split. Once they couldn't get anything else from him, they split. Fickle. God knows the heart of the people is fickle. And so he explains to them here in verses 25 and 26 that they are going to sin. Now, this is the first of 3 steps in a vicious cycle. Let's get the second step. We find that in verses 27 and 28. At that point that the people sin and worship idols, at that point, verse 27, and the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord will drive you. And there you will serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. So he tells them there the second step in this vicious cycle is the scattering. The people would sin, then God would scatter. They would be disobedient, then God would discipline. And so the second step in that, the scattering, he says in verse 27, and the Lord will scatter you. When you worship idols, God's going to scatter you among the peoples. And you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord will drive you. So it wasn't a promise that God was going to scatter them in the promised land. But don't worry, you'll still be in the promised land, but God's just going to scatter you. No. He says God's going to drive you out of this promised land and scatter you among the nations. Now, again, you just want to say, man, we haven't even moved in yet. Like, we're not even in the land yet, and we're already being told you're not going to be in the land for long. God's going to drive you out. You're going to be scattered. It's like, man, I can't even necessarily enjoy it. But that's not God's fault. That's not Moses' fault. That's the fault of the people, because the people are going to surrender themselves to idolatry. But the Lord God will scatter you. Now notice these details. And the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord will drive you. Why is that? Because God's going to scatter them, but also because those places that he scatters them to, they will suffer and die in those places. And there you will serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. Now, I want you to understand who he's talking to. He's talking to this new generation of Israelites. And he's telling them, look, after you commit idolatry, you commit sin, God's going to scatter you. And once he scatters you, you are going to become slaves. That's what he's describing in verse 28. You will become slaves to other gods. Now, that is exactly what had happened to their forefathers when they were in Egypt. What were the Israelites doing in Egypt? Were they just on vacation, next to the Nile River, taking pictures for the gram? Like, what were they doing there? Do you remember, those of you that know the story, when Moses first showed up and told Pharaoh, hey, God says, let my people go. Does anybody remember what Pharaoh's first response was? This had something to do with bricks. Anybody? Let's go back and just reread the whole story. No, I'm just kidding. The bricks, he says this. He says, okay. So what? The Israelites, they want to go, huh? They just have time to go worship. Okay, they got too much time on their hands. So I'll tell you what. Moses. From now on, they get no more straw to make their bricks. Now they got to make their bricks without straw. What were they doing there even making bricks? What they were doing was they were serving other gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. That's what their forefathers were doing in Egypt, is they ended up serving the Egyptian gods. And the Egyptians would say, I want you to build a temple, to this god. And they would put the Jews to work on that. And so they've done that before. But this new generation hasn't done it. They've been living in the wilderness. They've been traveling. They've got these wonderful new promises about this great new life in the promised land. But they themselves, they've had to work. Yeah, it's been a rough life because they've been living out in the wilderness, living in tents. But they've never had to make bricks with their own two hands. to serve other gods. They've never experienced that. And God is telling them here through Moses, that's what's going to happen. You're going to experience that. The Lord's going to scatter you. And this pattern, we'll get the third step in just a minute. Again, it's a three-part cycle, vicious cycle. But this is the way that it has always worked. You go back to Genesis. And it doesn't take very long. The very first family in existence, Adam and Eve, had two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel, right? Sin. And then what did he do to Cain? Does anybody know what he did to Cain? Anybody? He pushed him out. God says, you can't stay here anymore. You got to go. And pushed him out. And Cain was crying to the Lord, oh, but somebody's going to find me and they're going to kill me because I'm going to be out here by myself. And so it says that he put a mark on Cain so that people would leave him alone. I don't have any clue what the mark is, but he put a mark on him. So the sin and then the scattering. It's been happening since Genesis. And guess what? It happened in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua, Judges and Ruth and 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra. I mean, it just keeps on going. It's still happening. It's still happening. This is the pattern. But it's not just the pattern for the Israelites. We realize that this is the pattern like in my own life. I'm not even a Jew. But this is the pattern. Is I find myself with a sinful attitude or sinful actions. I disobey God, and then I find the judgment. So there's the disobedience and then the discipline, the scattering. Where I'm sinning, and then the result is I feel like I'm separated from God and like I'm out in the open, left to my own devices. Like what is going on? It's the judgment of God, the discipline of God. That's what he's telling the people here. Listen, when you sin, this is what's going to happen. You're going to be scattered. But good news. You say, what kind of good news could there be? In verse 29, he tells them, after the sin, come on. After the sin comes the scattering. From the scattering comes the seeking. But from there you will seek the Lord your God. What a trip. They're going to be spread out. They're going to be serving other false gods. And then from that point, serving some other god, they're going to go, hey, wait a minute. I need to seek the Lord. What am I doing here? Who remembers the story of the prodigal son? Anybody remember that? Anybody remember the story of the prodigal son? Okay, one of you. Good. It's good. It's good that you've been in church all of your life and you don't remember the prodigal son. Really cool story. Okay, really cool story. The prodigal son. What happens is this young man. I know this is going to be so unfamiliar to you, so I'll explain to you. Okay. This young man tells his dad, I don't like you anymore. I know more than you do. I want my inheritance. Give me my inheritance. Okay? Give me what I'm entitled to. Okay? The E word, entitlement. He says, give me what's mine. I want what's mine. And he gets the inheritance from his dad and he splits. And he says, forget you. And he lives, and we're told that he went and he just lived this riotous living. Meaning, he went to the casino. Come on, daddy needs a new pair of shoes. Spending money, big. Oh yeah, I got all kinds of friends. You know, when you got money, man, you got friends. Yeah, oh yeah, come on, I'll buy you meals and let's go and go hit the clubs and hit the bars, and they just went out and partied. You know, he went out and partied. And then what happens is this young man finds himself absolutely destitute, no money. His money's all gone. And he finds himself in a pig pen. Okay? I'm not talking peanuts here. I'm talking like an actual pig pen. And he's in the pig pen. And while he's there, this young cat is so hungry that he wanted to eat the food that the pigs were eating. And then it dawned on him. Inside of that pig pen. Now, again, I was at the LA County Fair, but I've seen pigs other places. You probably have seen pigs. Pigs, I don't know what it is about pigs, but they seem to love mud. It seems like the muddier, the dirtier, it's that they love that. And they will eat anything. They'll eat anything. And this young man is in the pig pen. He's feeding the hogs. Okay? Not even supposed to be, he's not even supposed to be working with pork, with pigs. He's a Jew. But there he is. He's feeding the animals. And then all of a sudden he goes, oh, wait, he has this thought. And he goes, you know what? What am I doing here? I'm so hungry. He says, I need to go back to my dad. And when I get there, I'm going to ask my dad to just hire me as one of his servants. He knows that his dad is gracious, knows that his dad will help him out if he goes back. And he figures, I'm sure, I can't be his son anymore. I can't have that position, but maybe he'll just let me work as one of his servants, and then I can eat some normal food. And so he gets up out of that pig pen and cleans himself off and starts making his way home. And the story goes that as he's making his way home, his dad is out there and sees him. What was his dad doing out there? I don't know. Maybe he's working the field. Maybe he was looking for his son. I don't know. But then the story goes, he's looking, he sees his son, girds up his loins. In other words, he picks up his clothing and he runs towards his son. And he embraces his son. And then his son goes through his speech, Father, I have sinned against you, and would you please hire me as your servant? And the dad's like, what are you even talking about? First of all, you stink, but no, come on in. And he says, we're going to party. We're gonna kill a fatted calf. We're going to party. We're going to eat asada all day long. And he welcomes the son back in. But in that pig pen is where all of a sudden the son came to his senses. What did he say here? But from there, from where? Verse 29. From where? From serving other gods. From there you will seek the Lord your God. And good news, verse 29, you will find him if you seek him with all your heart and with all your soul. That's what that young man was doing. But did you know, I don't know if you knew this or not, we've been told for a long time that story that I just related to you is the story of the prodigal son. It's not the prodigal son. That's not the point of the story. That is not the point of the story. The point of the story is the prodigal father. We look at the son like, oh, prodigal, reckless. He just lived this reckless life. And everybody does that. That's nothing new. Everybody knows that. This is what we do. The story is not the story of the prodigal son. It's the story of the prodigal father who was reckless in the love that he gave to his son, who was reckless in the mercy that he showed his son, the grace that he showed his son, the forgiveness that he showed. This is the story of the prodigal father. The son, no surprise that he would do that. But the dad just received him back and celebrated him being back. And yet we find the same thing in verse 29. You are going to be serving other gods. Verse 28, gods of wood and stone. But verse 29, but from there you will seek the Lord your God and you will find him. The relationship will be restored. That's a prodigal father. That's what that is. It's God being reckless with his love. Thus the famous song from a few years ago, Reckless Love. That's what it was all about. And then he says this in verse 30. When you are in distress and all these things come upon you in the latter days, when you turn to the Lord your God and obey his voice. For the Lord your God, I love this, verse 31, is a merciful God. He will not forsake you, nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant of your fathers, which he swore to them. He says, listen, you're going to sin. You will be scattered. But from that point of being scattered and separated, you will seek the Lord. You will seek the Lord. And so the stories are told. I'm sure that there are more than we even know of. But if you've ever heard of Corrie ten Boom, anybody ever heard of Corrie ten? Anybody ever heard of Corrie? Okay, good, yeah. Corrie ten Boom. If you do not know the story of Corrie ten Boom, T-E-N-B-O-O-M, I think it is, Corrie ten Boom. You need to look her up. Here's what happened is Corrie ten Boom was alive during the Holocaust. And her sister were actually captured by the Nazis and put into concentration camps with the Jews. Corey and her family and her sister, they were Christians. And so what happened is these two sisters began to conduct Bible studies inside of the concentration camps with all of the Jewish prisoners, the women, but in the women's camp. And they saw Jewish women, through the preaching of God's word, they saw Jewish women surrender their hearts to Jesus and be saved. Incredible, incredible stories. But you must understand that for many of those Jewish women, they got to that place in their life where they're down, as they say, when you're at the bottom, there's no way to go but up, right? Some people still seem to dig a little and go even further. But so many of these Jewish women, from being in that place of hardship, they looked to Jesus and ended up being saved. Incredible stories. You got to look it up and read about Corrie 10 because there were some incredible things that happened. Like the Nazi women, the security, they would not go into their barracks because it was infested with body lice. And so they were like, we're not going in there. We don't care what's happening in there. And so because the Nazi security guards would not go into their barracks, they had the freedom to preach the gospel whenever they wanted. Hold Bible studies. Because there were no guards coming in. Freedom. She got mad at her sister one time because her sister was thanking God for the body lice. I said, what are you doing? What are you talking about? And then she realized after, oh, God, thank you so much for the body lice, because he gave us the freedom to just preach the gospel freely. I mean, super gross, but incredible. These incredible stories. But the point being in verse 31 that God is merciful. He will not forsake you. Isn't that incredible? He will not forsake you nor destroy you nor forget the covenant of your fathers. I want you to, before we leave this section on seeking, look at verse 29 again. But from there you will seek the Lord your God and you will find him if you seek him with all your heart and with all your soul. Isn't that an incredible thought? That they would be idolaters at some point in the future and God was going to scatter them. But if they would seek the Lord, God would forgive them. I say, isn't that incredible? Because let me ask you a question. When you sin, when you've been living in disobedience, who's the last person that you want to have anything to do with? Isn't that crazy that when we sin, we run away from God? Isn't that a crazy thought? That when we sin, we run away from God. But here we're told in verse 31 that he's a merciful God. In Nehemiah chapter 9, he said, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, ready to pardon. It seems so strange that when we sin, we run away from God. We kind of disappear. From what we're reading here, what the Bible tells us, what we should do is when we sin, we should be running to God. Because God is merciful. And he's going to forgive us. We're going to find him when we seek him. That's what I want. Right? That's what I want. But we so often, man, that kind of knee-jerk reaction, is for me to just get away from God as fast as I can. Man, when I'm sinning and disobedient, what I want to do is I want to go back to God as fast as I can. God, please have mercy on me. Please forgive me. Please, wipe away those things. Give me forgiveness again. What a strange thing. We need to learn to seek God. Here, the people are being told God's not going to forsake you. He's not going to destroy you, nor forget the covenant of your fathers, which he swore to them. Now, we move on to the next. Now, this ends up being the pattern. This pattern will never stop. This is never going to stop. Sin, scattering, seeking. And then we'll go back to sin. And then being scattered. And then seeking the Lord. And then we'll go back to sin. This is always the pattern. You would think that God would just get tired of it and go, it's the same thing we've been doing for thousands of years. Let's change it up. I'm not gonna receive you guys anymore. But he doesn't. He just keeps accepting us back. Now we move on to the last section, beginning in verse 32, which is the favor of God. And he says, "For ask now concerning the days that are past." which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth. God created man on the earth. Notice he didn't say, since the day that man first began to evolve, since he first slithered out of the goo onto the shoreline and then became a man. He didn't say that. He says, since the day that God created man on the earth. So he takes it way back. Like, you know what, let's just go back to Genesis 1 and 2. I want you to think back to the beginning of time, verse 32, and ask from one end of heaven to the other whether any great thing like this has happened or anything like it has been heard. Now, the favor of God here, this section begins with a reminder. Remember, that's the theme of our series, reminders. And he's telling them here, ask now concerning the days that are past. Think back to the beginning of time. Think back from one end of heaven to the other. I want you to just think, as much as your brain can expand, I want you to think about this. And he tells them in verse 33, here's what he wants them to think about. Consider this. Did any people ever hear the voice of God speaking out of the midst of the fire as you have heard and live? He tells them something else here in verse 34. Not only remember that God spoke, but remember that God showed. Or did God ever try to go and take for himself a nation from the midst of another nation by trials, by signs, by wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great terrors, according to all that the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? Think back. Did God ever do that? Did God ever have people so special that he did this for them? That's the point that he's trying to make. Like, God hasn't done this. God's not done this for anybody else. He did it for you guys. Therein lies a problem for many of us. If you were raised in a Christian home, there's a danger there that lies beneath the surface. I want you to think about this. Think about who he's talking to. And he says, ask now concerning the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth. Were they there? Were the people there when God created man on the earth? Were they there in Genesis 1 and 2? No, right? They weren't there. Ask from one end of heaven to the other. But notice what he also says at the end of verse 34. He says, according to all that the Lord God did for you in Egypt before your eyes. Wait a minute. The people were saved out of slavery in Egypt. They left. At some point, it wasn't long after, they got to Kadesh. And there was an incident there where the people disobeyed God. And then God said this. He said, you know what? You didn't trust me. You didn't want to live by faith. You won't go into the promised land. He says, you're not going in. And he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to march you around the wilderness for 40 years until what happens? Does anybody remember? What would happen over the 40-year span?
All the old people would die.
All the old people would die. And what would happen, God says, he says, once all the old people are dead, I'll take the new generation, those that were very young at that point and those that hadn't even been born yet. And he says, for the next 40 years, I'll raise up another generation and I'll take them into the promised land. So let me ask you a question. He tells them, you need to remember that God spoke and that God showed you. God spoke from the fire. God showed you with signs and miracles. These people were either not there or they were too young to remember. But he's telling them, don't forget about what happened to you guys in the past. You see, they would be in danger of going, well, I wasn't there. I don't really know what you're talking about. I mean, I heard about it, but I wasn't there. Therein lies a danger for those of you that have been raised or are being raised in Christian homes. There's a danger there that you, because you have not experienced the hardship of a life without Christ on your own, it can oftentimes be fantasy. It's not reality. You weren't there before when your parents were not saved. And maybe you've heard some of the stories of your parents saying, listen, before I got saved, this is how I was living. And maybe there was drug use. Maybe there was gang activity. In fact, I know for some of you, there was your parents was drug use, gang activity, illicit relationships, thievery. I've talked to your parents, I know. I know how some of them used to be. But you weren't there. What you are experiencing is the benefits and blessings and the produce of your parents surrendering themselves to the Lord. And it can become a danger for you when all you have, when all you've ever grown up with is the goodness of God. And it oftentimes, it reveals itself. You see the fruition, you see the fruit of it. And let me ask you a question. Don't answer this out loud because I'm not trying to embarrass anybody, but do you live in a home? And let me ask you a question. Do you have a separate home for your cars? Well, it's attached. Does that really count? No. You've got a house for yourself, and then your car has a house. Let's go a step further. Does your dog, he or she, have his own house? How about a refrigerator? Everybody's got a refrigerator, don't they? I'll tell you a story. But before we do that, let me ask you something. Do you have a packed refrigerator? And if there's not anything in there that you know how we do, we go to the refrigerator, packed out, oh, there's nothing in here to eat. Then you go out to the garage, to the other refrigerator. That just happens to be next to the deep freezer inside of the house that I have for my cars. Do you go to your closet and you got everything that you need? I was going to say want. I know you don't have everything you want, right? We always want more. One more pair of shoes, one more, but you go to your closet and it's just full. You go, oh man, look at that. Just, what do? We go to the same thing as the refrigerator. We go to the closet and we go, man, I don't have anything to wear. Right? We go look at our, man, got all these nasty 10 pairs of tennis shoes. I ain't got no shoes to wear. Right? Those are things that we say. We're experiencing the benefits of a life that's been surrendered to the Lord. But oftentimes when you're young, what you're experiencing is the benefits of your parents being saved at some point in the past. And they try to relay the stories to you and tell you, man, this is what it was like without Christ. And you're kind of like, well, I don't really know. Like, I've grown up with all of this stuff, and this is just normal. I'm entitled to these things. Some of you have been to Nicaragua with me and you've seen the condition of some of the people that live there. Some of you have been to Mexico with me and you've seen the condition of some of the people that live there. I was in the Philippines a few years ago and we were doing home visits with the church. Our team, we all split up and small groups went to go do home visits. I went to a home. This is a Christian family, a family from the church in Philippines. We got there, we parked on the side of the road, walked back into the jungle. We came upon, in the jungle, from a distance, we saw this small brick building made out of gray bricks, 4 walls. There was a cutout for a door, but no door. There was a cutout for windows, but no windows. We walk up, hello, we're here, this is what we're doing. We walk in to find, I walk into this room, I look around, there's no electricity in this room. These are Christian brothers and sisters, our Christian brothers and sisters. Walk in, there's no electricity in this home. No door, no windows, dirt floor. I look over across from the front door and the kitchen area is over there. There's a table. There's no counters, no refrigerator, no coffee maker in the corner just waiting for somebody to drop a pot in. There's no microwave. There was no sink, turn on, wash your hands, wash your vegetables, whatever. Looked around, there's no TVs, no electricity. Back in the jungle, and it's getting kind of dark already. This was dark in the home. And they said, hey, would you like to sit down? There's nothing to sit on. So what do? You plop your hind parts on the dirt. And you sit down, and we begin to talk to them. And they had two little boys. It's a Christian family. Christian family. They had two little boys, about that big. Both of them were blind, born blind. And as we're talking, they said, hey, would you like our sons to play a song for you? Play a song? Yeah, they play the ukulele. Yeah, I'd love that. They went into their little area of the home, had a little room area, and they went in there, and they had all their clothes kind of neatly piled on the ground, and they came out with ukuleles, two little blind boys. And they sit down, and they began to strum those ukuleles in unison. And you know what they started to sing? They didn't start to sing like, oh, let me share this, I'm going to share the Delta Blues with you and tell you about all of the bad times in my life, and, I've seen some hardships and hard times. No, they began to worship God, began to sing a worship song with their ukuleles. And I'm sitting there thinking like, man, like, what do you have to be thankful for? Like, I got a home for my cars, I got a home for my dog. What do you have? You got a dirt floor, no electricity, no door, no windows, no flushing toilet, no running water, no refrigerator, no coffee pot. What do you have? What do you have to be so thankful for? It was their relationship with God. That's what they had. They had discovered very early in life, without any vision, they realized that I'm not entitled to anything. I got what I got, and thank God for it. That was it. Most of us were entitled, man. Like, no, you have to take me to the mall, or you have to take me here, or you have to provide these things for me. And you got some ground to stand on, because in the U.S. we've got laws, right? And your parents have to take care of you until you're 18 legally and all that kind of stuff. All right, yeah, they gotta feed you and all those different things. But do we find ourselves so entitled because we've been experiencing all the blessings of God? But those blessings are a result of a parent's life that many years ago surrendered to the Lord. Their life was much different. We don't know that life, right? Because we weren't there. That's what these people, they weren't in Egypt. They don't know what it's like to be enslaved to some false gods and to be enslaved to the Egypt. They don't know. And yet God is telling them, listen, it's going to happen. It's coming. You need to remember, when you're in that place, surrender your heart to the Lord. And he'll save you, but it's going to be a hard life. And he's telling them here in this section, verses 32 through 40, listen, you got to remember, you got to look back. And listen, I'm telling you guys here today, 2023, right now, I'm telling you, you need to go home and talk to your parents and say, hey, wait a minute. If they were not raised in a Christian home and they got saved somewhere along the line, you need to ask them, hold on, wait a minute. What was it like living without Christ? Because you don't know. You don't have a clue. You don't know. And you got to go ask them, what was it like? What was it like? What was it like to be lost, to be empty, to not knowing if you were going to go to heaven or go to hell? Some of your parents, no doubt, grew up in some pretty gnarly conditions. Ask them, what was it like? Well, I was on drugs, and this happened, and I was living out of my car or whatever. You're going to hear some craziness. But what that will do is the same thing that this will do for the Israelites. What it was going to do was help them to understand where their people had come from, what they had, which was so beautiful, a relationship with God. And that would help them to stay the course as far as following God. They needed to remember the favor of God, the fact that he spoke to them out of the fire, the fact that he showed miracles and signs and wonders when he saved the people out of Egypt. Now he goes on in verse 35 to say, to you it was shown that you might know that the Lord himself is God. There is none other besides him. Out of heaven, he let you hear his voice, that he might instruct you. On earth he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. And because he loved your fathers, not because the fathers loved him, because he loved the fathers. Your dad, who was such a scoundrel before he got saved years ago, he's not saved because he loved God. He's saved because God loved him first. Your dad simply responded to God's love with or by returning that love. That's how this works. Because he loved your fathers, therefore he chose their descendants after them. You see what he just told them? He told them, listen, you guys right here, this new generation, he said, listen, the reason you're experiencing all of this blessing, he's telling them, he says, it's because God loved your fathers. And because he loved your fathers, he chose you guys. We ought never have the mindset that, you know what, I'm entitled to things and God owes me and my parents owe me. No, you're living off of blessings that because God loved your mom and your dad, or maybe your grandparents or whoever, because he loved them, you right now are experiencing blessing. You need to keep that in mind. I need to keep that in mind. I need to remember, because what that'll do is help me to be thankful and go, oh man, I'm God's not like, God doesn't think I'm just so cool and he's just blessing me with all with got TV in every room and a TV in the bathroom and I can sit on the toilet and play PlayStation or whatever. I need to remember that the things that I have are a result of God loving me, choosing me. Doesn't have anything to do with me doing something or being super cool or, so lovable and huggable like a teddy bear. It's because God loved me. Therefore, he chose their descendants after them, and he brought you out of Egypt with his presence and with his mighty power. Verse 38, driving out from before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in, to give you their land as an inheritance as it is this day. Therefore, know this day, and consider it in your heart, that the Lord himself is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath. There is no other. Now, because of all of that, and this is where we finish, because of the favor of God and the fact that they would remember, that should cause them to remain faithful. Verse 40, you shall therefore keep his statutes and his commandments, which I command you today, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which the Lord your God is giving you for all time. He says you need to remain faithful. If you remain faithful, number one, you will experience blessing. That it may go well with you and your children after you. And secondly, he says, if you remain faithful, you will extend your time in the land. He says that in the second half of verse 40, and that you may prolong your days in the land, which the Lord your God is giving you for all time. And we'll talk about that phrase, for all time, in just a minute when we finish. But there are biblical principles here. That when I disobey, God disciplines. He disciplines so that I will return to him. That's the way that works. Biblical principles. Here's another one. That when I remain faithful, I continue to experience God's blessing. When I remain faithful, I continue to experience God's blessing. But also remaining faithful, he told them this will extend your time in the land. For us, what it does is it extends the time that we experience God's provision and protection and his power, all of that. It's a biblical principle. When I obey, blessing. When I disobey, discipline. When I obey, blessing. Doesn't mean everything's always peachy and perfect and it's always sunny. But when I continue to obey God, that relationship with him stays intact and I continue to experience his blessing. But when I disobey, then it's time to discipline, and that will I begin to rip myself off. I want to experience blessing. I want to extend my time in whatever God has for me. I want to extend that. I want to be wherever God's at, whatever he's doing. I want to be there as long as I possibly can. That's the goal. And so in order for me to do that, I need to remain faithful to him, remembering all of his goodness to me from the past. There is that short phrase there, and this is where we're going to finish in verse 40. We will not cover the remainder of the chapter. But verse 40, he says, in the land which the Lord your God has given you for all time. We need to just remember that, just real briefly. Not going to spend a lot of time, but you just need to know this. Every so often, I mean, it's ongoing, but every so often it'll come along in your feed again, where you'll hear, Israel is so bad, and they're mistreating, and there's some, uprising in the Gaza Strip or, the West Bank, and, oh, Israel, they're kicking out these people, and, you hear all of this craziness, and you can begin to think that, oh, Israel, I don't even know, like, why are they even in the land? This is why. God's told them several times. We've read it if you've been here, but if you haven't, here it is again. Which the Lord your God is giving you for all time. The land of Israel belongs to the Israelites, to the Jews. It belongs to them. Why? Did they take it from someone else? Yeah. In fact, God did. God took it from the Canaanites a long time ago. And did they move back in years later in 1948, I think it was? Did they move back in? Yeah, they did. Why? Because the land is theirs for all time. Why? Because God said. That's why. So you can argue and be mad about, oh, they kicked these people out, or the people, they were in the land first, these people, and that's not fair. Okay, I don't know what to tell you. Argue with God. You can tell God about it, because God said it's their land for all time. It's always going to be their land. Ever since He gave it to them, it always has been their land. So we can argue and fight and keyboard warrior, post, Israel, forget those guys or whatever, and they're no good or whatever. You can say whatever you want, but God said that it's their land. Now, it doesn't mean that the Jews are just always right and they can mistreat anybody that they want, because it's their land. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the land is theirs. That's it. Do they misuse it sometimes? Oh, sure, yeah. Do they mistreat people? I'm sure they do. Are the Jews in Israel always right? No. But it's their land. How can you say that? Because God said it. I didn't say it. God said it. You and I want to check our hearts this morning and make sure that we're not living on someone else's faith. You see, that's essentially what Moses has been telling the people. You're getting ready to go into the promised land. And your parents have all died by now. You got to make sure that you have your own relationship with God and that you are being faithful to Him. And you and I have to do that same thing. We got to check our hearts and say, wait a minute, am I living on my own faith right now, or am I living on my parents' faith? I'm experiencing blessing from God through my parents. There's no doubt about that. But what about my faith? Is it mine or is it just theirs and I'm just kind of along for the ride? I got to have my own. Father, thank you so much for this morning.